When I first read my father's will, my hands went cold. Not because I was surprised he was gone, his illness had made that part inevitable, but because of what wasn't there. My mother's name. My name. The paper crinkled in my trembling fingers as I scanned every line, hoping I'd missed something. I hadn't. Every cent, every piece of property, every stock and bond, all left to a woman named Evelyn Pierce. A name we'd never heard in our lives. Mother sat beside me, her face a perfect stillness that only years of discipline could carve. Her lips pressed together, and for a long moment, the only sound in the lawyer's office was the slow ticking of an antique clock behind the mahogany desk. "Who is she?" I whispered. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and avoided my gaze. "I believe Miss Pierce was an acquaintance of your father's." An acquaintance. That word hit like a blade wrapped in velvet. When the meeting ended, my mother walked out without a word. Outside, the spring air was too bright, too cruel. The sunlight glared off the polished hood of her old Bic, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out flat. "He left us for good this time." Before the will, before the betrayal, my father had always been a complicated man. To the world, he was Harold Whitman, a respected architect known for his sharp suits and steady smile. To me, he was the man who'd built a glass house in more ways than one, transparent to everyone but himself. He wasn't affectionate, not the way mothers are. His love was measured in gestures: an envelope for my tuition, a signed birthday card with a $200 check, a half-hearted "I'm proud of you" when I graduated from law school. He didn't know how to hug without keeping one hand in his pocket. My mother, Lydia, was the opposite: warm, poetic, endlessly patient. She'd been an art teacher before marriage, then became what my father liked to call a homemaker. I used to watch her trace invisible lines across the kitchen counter when she cooked, as if painting something only she could see. For years, I thought our family was ordinary. Not perfect, but whole. We had dinner together every Sunday: roast chicken, jazz on the radio, and polite silences that grew heavier as I got older. I learned early that certain subjects, his work, his late nights, his business trips, were best left untouched. Then came the stroke. It hit him fast, left him half paralyzed and furious at the world. Mother cared for him every day, her gentle hands feeding him soup and arranging his pillows. I came home from DC every weekend, juggling my job at the firm and my guilt. And in all that time, in the hospital rooms, the sterile smell of disinfectant, the whispered prayers at midnight, not once did he mention Evelyn Pierce. It was only after the funeral that I began to notice the small cracks. A stranger at the service, a tall woman in her late 40s, stood near the back, black veil covering her face. When I looked her way, she lowered her eyes. I remember thinking she didn't look like a mourner. She looked like someone making sure she wasn't noticed. Later, while helping my mother pack his study, I found a letter. It was tucked in an old sketchbook, folded so many times the edges had worn thin. "My dearest Harold, I visited the house again. The roses you planted are blooming early this year. You always said red was my color. Yours always, Evelyn." The handwriting was elegant, almost theatrical. I felt my stomach twist. My mother was in the next room sorting through his suits. I could hear hangers clinking softly. "Mom," I said. "Did Dad ever mention a woman named Evelyn?" She froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to notice. "No," she said, too quickly. "Why?" I slipped the letter into my pocket before she could ask more. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every small, strange thing: the missed anniversaries, the untraceable withdrawals from his joint account, the new credit card statement that arrived 3 months before he died, one my mother hadn't opened because she thought it was business-related. By dawn, the pieces had begun to form a shape I didn't want to see. When the sun rose, pale and indifferent, I made coffee for my mother and placed the letter beside her mug. She read it once, then again. Her hands didn't shake. Her face didn't crumble. She just exhaled, long and quiet. "I knew," she said finally. "I didn't have proof. But I knew. And then she did something that broke me more than the will itself. She smiled. Not bitterly, not angrily, just a tired, human smile. At least now I can stop wondering why he always came home smelling like roses. 2 weeks later, the lawyer called. He'd accidentally forwarded a document meant for the executor. It listed the transfer of my father's largest property, a 12-acre vineyard estate, to Evelyn Pierce, completed just months before his death. Estimated value, $4.3 million. That was when something in me snapped. I wasn't going to let my mother fade quietly into some tragic stereotype of the abandoned wife. I wasn't going to let this woman, this stranger, walk away with everything we'd built our lives around. So I did what I was trained to do. I began investigating. Public records, property transfers, archived bank statements, each detail painting a clearer picture. Evelyn had been on his payroll under consulting services for over 10 years. There were joint accounts, life insurance policies naming her as a beneficiary, even a second cell phone under her address. Every discovery felt like a fresh betrayal. Then came the confrontation. I found her address through a property record search, an elegant townhouse overlooking the river. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised. She looked ready. "You must be Nora," she said softly. Her voice was calm, almost kind. "He told me about you." My throat tightened. "You mean us, his wife and daughter?" Evelyn sighed and gestured for me to come in. The house was immaculate, white walls, glass vases, and a faint scent of roses. Always roses. "I didn't steal him," she said, pouring tea like we were old friends. "He came to me. Long before you think he did." I wanted to scream. To throw the cup against the wall. But I didn't. I sat there and listened, because that's what my father had trained me to do, to gather facts before you act. According to her, their affair began when my mother was pregnant with me. He'd promised to leave, but never did. Over the years, he divided his life neatly, half lived in daylight, half in shadow. She claimed she'd cared for him during his business trips, nursed him through surgeries my mother never knew about. He was a man split in two, she said. He didn't know how to be whole with anyone. When I stood to leave, she handed me a photograph. My father, younger, smiling, arm around her waist. It was dated 3 years ago. "Whatever you think of me," she said, "I loved him. I still do." I didn't reply. I walked out into the rain and let it soak through my coat, erasing everything but the ache. That night, my mother waited in the kitchen, the letter still on the table. When I told her what I'd found, she just nodded. "He built an empire on half-truths," she said. "I suppose it's fitting that it ends the same way." Then, almost as if to herself, "But we're not going to let him erase us." It was the first time since his death that I saw a spark in her eyes again. "Tomorrow," she said, "we fight." The next morning, the sky was overcast, the kind of grey that presses down on you like a held breath. My mother was already dressed when I came downstairs, her hair pinned neatly, her black notebook in hand. "I called the lawyer," she said, without looking up. "We're contesting the will." For a moment, I just stood there, watching her pour coffee with steady precision. Something inside me shifted, a quiet recognition that this wasn't just about money. It was about dignity. I nodded. "Then let's do it right." The first step was gathering proof. I had contacts at the courthouse, a few old colleagues in finance. The paper trail my father left behind wasn't clean, but it was traceable. The man who once prided himself on order had built a labyrinth of accounts, all leading back to Evelyn Pierce. Bank transfers disguised as charitable donations. Consulting fees to EP Solutions LLC. Even an insurance beneficiary change form signed 3 months before his death. I stayed up for nights combing through spreadsheets, my eyes aching, my heart hollow. Mother worked beside me, sorting through boxes of old documents, receipts, even photographs. Each one told a story she never wanted to know. Once, she paused over a small silver pen engraved with my father's initials. "He gave this to her," she murmured. I thought he'd lost it. I didn't know what to say. So I said nothing. When we filed the contestation, Evelyn responded within the week. Her lawyer was sharp, younger than me, with a polished grin and an eagerness that reeked of arrogance. He claimed my father was fully sound of mind when he made the transfers. He framed Evelyn as a devoted companion who supported him emotionally and professionally. Professionally. The word made my mother laugh, a bitter, quiet sound that didn't belong to her. She supported him emotionally, she said. While I fed him soup after his stroke. The case moved slowly. Days became weeks, weeks stretched into months. The courtroom became a second home, the stale air, the wooden benches, the low murmur of legal jargon mixing with the occasional scrape of a pen. Every hearing was a reminder of how deeply betrayal could echo. Evelyn sat across from us, her posture perfect, her expression composed. She dressed in muted tones, navy, beige, ivory, as if to look respectable, untouched. I noticed how she avoided my eyes. Our lawyer, Mr. Landry, built our argument around undue influence. My father's medical reports showed he had mild cognitive decline after his stroke. The timing of the property transfer matched the worst of his symptoms. But it wasn't just a legal case. It was an excavation of everything we'd been told to ignore. The judge asked questions like, was Mr. Whitman's marriage stable? Did he confide in anyone outside his family? Were there signs of estrangement? Each answer was a wound reopened. Mother sat still, her voice calm. We were married for 42 years. We had our storms, but I was there when he needed me. Every time. After one long hearing, Evelyn approached me in the courthouse hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, washing everything in pale, cold color. I didn't want this, she said quietly. I told him to leave things as they were. But he insisted. He said you'd be fine. Fine. I repeated. He left us nothing. She met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that didn't feel like arrogance. It was regret. I never asked for his estate, she said. I asked him to be honest. He couldn't. I studied her for a moment. She wasn't lying, not entirely. Maybe she had loved him in her own way, a selfish, secret way. But love built on deceit doesn't deserve inheritance. Then give it back, I said. Her lips parted, a tiny tremor in her composure. It's not that simple. But it was. It always had been. Back home, my mother began to fade. Not physically, she was strong, sharp, but emotionally. She'd wake early, make tea, sit by the kitchen window staring at the empty driveway where my father's car used to be. Some nights, I'd hear her talking to herself softly, half conversations with ghosts. Harold, you could have just told me. We could have lived smaller, simpler. I tried to keep her spirits up, reminding her that truth had a way of surfacing. But the fight was wearing us both down. Then one afternoon, while cleaning out the attic, I found something that changed everything. An old lockbox. Inside, a series of letters, not from Evelyn, but to her. From my father. Dozens of them. Most were brief, but one stood out. You've always been my peace, Evelyn. Lydia never understood the man I've become. You saw the version I wanted to be. If anything happens to me, make sure you take care of the vineyard. It's yours as much as mine. The vineyard. The same property he left her. I took the letter to our lawyer the next morning. Can this help? He scanned it, then looked up. It proves emotional involvement, but not legality. He paused. However, if he was financially compensating her while under medical supervision, we can argue exploitation. Mother sat silently, hands folded in her lap. Then she whispered, use everything. News spreads fast in small towns. When word got out that Harold Whitman's mistress was fighting his widow and daughter for the estate, people started whispering. The newspaper ran a small headline, Architect's estate dispute raises questions of influence. Old friends stopped calling. Some offered quiet sympathy, others stayed away. My father's reputation was beginning to unravel, and so was Evelyn's. One morning, I received an anonymous envelope at our doorstep. Inside were 2 photographs, Evelyn and my father at the vineyard, dated months before his stroke. And behind them, handwritten notes about bank withdrawals that didn't match his records. Someone wanted us to win. We presented the photos as supplemental evidence. Evelyn's attorney objected, but the judge allowed them to be entered. Slowly, the image of my father's sound mind began to crumble. At the next hearing, Evelyn didn't speak much. She just sat there, pale, distant. Her lawyer pressed for settlement, but we refused. We weren't after vengeance. We were after truth. The decision came 6 months later. I'll never forget the way the judge's voice echoed in that silent courtroom. After review of the evidence and medical records, this court finds that the late Mr. Whitman's estate was transferred under conditions of undue influence. The transfers to Ms. Evelyn Pierce are hereby nullified. Assets will revert to the legal spouse, Mrs. Lydia Whitman, and her daughter, Nora Whitman. It was over. Mother closed her eyes and let out a long, steady breath, not joy, not triumph, just release. Evelyn didn't stay for the aftermath. She left before the reporters arrived, before anyone could see her tears. That night, we didn't celebrate. We sat on the porch in silence, the sunset bleeding through the clouds. Mother finally turned to me. "He loved 2 lives," she said. "Now we have to live one that matters." I reached for her hand, the way she'd done for me 1,000 times as a child. "We will." In the months that followed, we liquidated the vineyard. The money could have been used to buy comfort, new cars, new houses. But that wasn't my mother's way. "This isn't blood money," she said. "It's seed money." And that's how the Whitman Foundation for Widowed Women was born, her idea, her healing. We turned betrayal into purpose. The first few months were slow. Donations trickled in. We hosted small events, art therapy workshops, support groups. But soon, it grew. Newspapers began to write about us again, not as victims, but as builders of something better. One evening, as we were closing up the small office downtown, a delivery arrived. A single box with no return address. Inside was a bouquet of red roses and a card that read, "For what it's worth, he loved you both. E." Mother stared at the card for a long time. Then she placed it gently in the trash. "He loved himself most," she said. "But I'll take the flowers." For the first time in months, the house was quiet. No more phone calls from lawyers. No more courtroom dates circled in red on the kitchen calendar. Just the sound of the wind moving through the magnolia tree outside my window and my mother humming softly as she watered her plants. But silence has a strange way of amplifying what's left behind. The day the final estate funds were transferred, I sat at my desk staring at the balance. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like ashes, like everything we'd fought for had come from a fire that never should have started. My mother walked in, holding a cup of tea. "You're thinking too much again," she said with a knowing smile. "Do you ever stop?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "No," she said. "But I try to think softer." That was her gift, finding gentleness where most people would find rage. We used part of the settlement to pay off the house, then put the rest toward the foundation. Every decision went through her. Every dollar felt like a promise to reclaim something he'd broken. But for me, closure didn't come that easily. Because even after winning, I still didn't understand why. Why her? Why Evelyn? Why the secrecy? Why not us? It started one evening in late autumn. I was sorting through the last of my father's boxes in the attic, a self-inflicted ritual I couldn't seem to stop. Among the blueprints and receipts, I found an old cassette tape. It was labeled in his handwriting, "Vineyard Plans, 1998. I didn't own a cassette player, but my mother did, a dusty one from her teaching days. When I pressed play, I expected to hear notes about construction, maybe budgets. Instead, I heard his voice. "If anyone finds this, they'll probably think I'm selfish. Maybe I am. But the truth is, I'm tired of being two people. Evelyn believes in me the way Lydia once did. And Nora, she's strong. Stronger than she knows. I hope one day she'll understand. I froze. His tone wasn't defensive or guilty, it was weary. Like a man standing in the ruins of his own choices, still trying to justify the view. I listened 3 times before stopping the tape. My mother found me sitting there, eyes red, the player still humming softly. "What did you find?" she asked gently. His voice, I whispered. And his excuses. She didn't ask to hear it. She just sat beside me. After a long silence, she said, "He was weak, Nora. Weak men dress their guilt as love." Then she reached over, pressed the stop button, and the house went quiet again. A month later, a letter arrived addressed to me in careful handwriting. No return address. Postmarked from another state. Inside was a single sheet. "Nora, I don't expect forgiveness. But you deserve the truth. Your father and I met when your mother left to care for her dying sister. He was lonely, and I was foolish enough to believe that made it love. Over the years, I begged him to tell you both. He never could. When he got sick, he told me to make sure you and your mother were taken care of. I thought that meant he'd arranged something fair. I didn't know he'd left you nothing. I gave back what I could. The rest I've donated, not to ease guilt, but because I couldn't keep what wasn't mine. You have every right to hate me. But I hope, one day, you'll see that some of us loved him, too, even if we shouldn't have. Evelyn." I stared at the page for a long time. It was smudged near the bottom, maybe from tears, maybe from rain. My instinct was to throw it away. But I didn't. I showed it to my mother that night. She read it silently, folded it once, and slid it into a drawer. "I suppose that's her confession," she said. "A little late, but still." Then, softly, "He broke 2 women in different ways, didn't he?" I nodded. "Yes," I said. But only one of them stayed standing. The following spring, our foundation hosted its first major fundraising gala. It was small, just 50 guests, but every table carried a story. Widows, single mothers, women rebuilding after loss. My mother looked radiant in her soft lavender dress, greeting guests like an old friend. When it was my turn to speak, I stood before them, hands trembling slightly around the microphone. "My father built houses for a living," I began. "But the one he left us, the emotional one, had cracks we didn't see until it nearly fell apart. My mother taught me that when something breaks, you don't always throw it away. Sometimes, you rebuild. And you build stronger." There was quiet applause, the kind that feels like shared understanding more than celebration. Afterward, a woman approached me, middle-aged, with kind eyes. "I lost everything when my husband passed," she said. "But listening to you, I think I can start again." It was in that moment I realized, maybe the real inheritance wasn't land or money. It was resilience. The ability to stand up, again and again, even when the ground has been stolen from beneath you. A week later, I saw her. Evelyn. She stood outside the community center where we hosted our programs, hair shorter now, her face lined with time. For a second, I didn't recognize her. "I didn't want to intrude," she said when I stepped outside. "I just wanted to see what you built." There was no malice in her voice. Only exhaustion. "You came all this way," I said carefully. "Why?" She looked down at her hands. "Because guilt doesn't fade when the money's gone. I needed to know you used it better than either of us ever did." I crossed my arms. "We did." She nodded. "I can see that." Then she pulled a folded photograph from her purse, an old one of my father, sitting at the vineyard, sketching the house he never finished. "He was happiest when he built," she said softly. "I think he'd be proud of what you're doing." For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt pity and, strangely, a sliver of peace. Maybe she wasn't the villain I'd made her to be. Maybe she was just another casualty of my father's inability to choose truth over comfort. When she turned to leave, I stopped her. "Evelyn," I said. "For what it's worth, I don't hate you anymore." She froze, her shoulders trembling. "That's more grace than I deserve." "Maybe," I said. "But it's not for you. It's for me." That night, I sat with my mother on the porch again, the stars blinking faintly over the quiet neighborhood. "She came today," I said. "I know," my mother replied without surprise. "I saw her car." "Did you speak?" "Yes. I think she's finally done running." My mother smiled faintly. "Good. Let her find her peace. We've already found ours." We sat in silence, the cicadas humming softly. I realized then that peace doesn't come with victory or closure, it comes when the anger finally exhausts itself and all that's left is understanding. I thought of my father not as the man who betrayed us, but as the man who couldn't bear to face the consequences of his own choices. And somehow, that made it easier to let go. The last box of his things sat untouched in my study for months. One afternoon, I opened it. Inside was a small wooden plaque that read, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what grows after you're gone." I traced the carved letters with my fingers. For the first time, I smiled. He hadn't lived by that wisdom, but maybe, through us, it could still mean something. I hung it in the office of the foundation the next day. It's still there. Whenever someone asks what inspired us, I tell them. A man's mistake. And two women's decision to make it right. The first time I realized our story had stopped being ours alone was at the grocery store, in front of the apples. A woman from church, someone who had hugged my mother at the funeral and brought a casserole in a dish we never returned, leaned over her cart and said, "You must feel so vindicated," as if vindication were something you could slice and serve on a plate. My mother smiled the way you smile when a child says something impolite in public. I moved us along. The town did what towns do. It talked. The newspaper printed the ruling as if it were weather, brief and inevitable. A radio host mentioned undue influence between commercials for tire rotation and pest control. Sometimes people tried to comfort me in the produce aisle with words that made everything smaller than it was. Other times, they avoided my eyes like loss was contagious. The quiet ones were my favorite. Their silence felt like respect. What I didn't expect was the call from my father's firm. They wanted me to attend a board meeting. I brought my mother. She wore a navy dress and the pearls she only wore for court, graduations, and funerals, the kinds of days when polite armor mattered. The conference room smelled like new carpet and strong coffee. A framed portrait of my father hung on the far wall, his smile frozen in the familiar way, as if the photographer had asked him to think of something he loved and he'd chosen himself. The managing partner cleared his throat. "We're reviewing the name on our annual scholarship," he said, tapping a pen against a folder. "Given recent events, we thought it appropriate to transition it to the Foundation for Widowed Women. With your permission, of course." My mother blinked. "You don't need our permission to do what's decent," she said, but her voice softened at the end. The men around the table shifted, relieved. They made a short speech about legacy and learning. I listened and watched a small, unremarkable thing happen inside me. I let go of needing them to condemn him. It was enough that they chose to help us build something he never did. On the way home, the car was quiet. The road unwound in a gray ribbon and the magnolias along the boulevard were beginning to show their waxy buds. My mother traced a circle on her knee with her thumb, a habit she had when she was thinking hard. "People keep confusing justice with revenge," she said. "I don't want to ruin his name. I just don't want his lies to be the last thing it stands for." We were invited to speak at church, not from the pulpit, my mother refused that, but in the fellowship hall where coffee tastes like tin and cookies crumble into your palms like old paper. The women brought chairs into a circle and someone plugged in a wheezing electric kettle. The room hummed with the sound of folding metal and soft greetings. It struck me how many of us were there because of a man's decisions and the quiet work required to keep a life from falling through the floor. When it was my turn, I told the truth the way a careful person does, measuring it so it doesn't harm the ones who weren't the cause. I said we had been loved imperfectly and betrayed thoroughly and that we were choosing not to be ruined by either. Then my mother spoke, and all my careful language evaporated in the warmth of her voice. If you are standing here because someone handed you a broken thing, she said, you have two hands for a reason. She didn't cry. None of us did. We drank coffee and asked each other if we were sleeping, and we passed a plate for the foundation in a way that felt more like passing a note in class than raising money. Here, read this, I see you. Not everyone liked the way the story ended. A letter came, unsigned, from a woman who believed my mother should have left with nothing out of principle. Another from a man who wrote in tidy block letters that mistresses don't appear without invitations. I didn't answer either. Some arguments are designed to keep you where pain put you. I set the letters in a drawer with old warranties and a brochure about roof shingles, which felt like a proper burial, flat, quiet, practical. There was a louder kind of consequence, too. A local columnist wrote a piece titling My Father the Architect of Two Lives. It was neat and cruel in the way tidy sentences are. He quoted people who had worked for my father, some charitable, some less so, and concluded with the sort of insight that fits into a headline but not into a life. My mother didn't read it. I did, once, and put it away. When your grief has been catalogued by strangers, the last thing it needs is circulation. We were asked to attend the scholarship ceremony at the firm. This time the room felt different, less like a place where decisions are made and more like a place where something is finally unmade, and the light can reach it. The recipient, a young woman whose husband had died in a construction accident, stood at the podium with a paper that shook in her hands. When I thought I had nothing, she said, another woman held the other end of the rope. I watched my mother smile. It was the kind that starts inside the eyes. Afterward, a man I didn't recognize approached us. He wore a suit that fit too well, the kind of face you forget as soon as you look away. He was a good mentor, he said, nodding at the portrait. He meant my father. Demanding, but fair. He paused. I'm sorry for what he did to you. He said it plainly, like an engineer describing a failed beam. There was relief in the honesty. You can carry a lot when the weight is properly named. Evelyn did not disappear. She didn't attend the meetings or send more roses, but I'd see her sometimes, at the pharmacy, reading a label with the concentration of someone translating a language she had never wanted to learn, on the river path early in the morning, walking as if the air were thinner than it used to be. Once, we passed each other on the bridge. She didn't look away. How is your mother? She asked. Watering everything, I said, and we both heard more than we said. There were other ripples. A cousin called from out of state to remind us of the time my father missed a Christmas because of a client emergency. We both knew whose emergency it had been. An old family friend who had always told too long stories at barbecues stopped mid-sentence when he saw my mother at the farmer's market and then picked up again as if a sentence could be walked around like a puddle. People have 1,000 ways of not stepping in what's true. On a bright Saturday, the foundation hosted a legal clinic for women who needed help navigating pensions and estates, the small artillery of papers that can protect a life if someone teaches you which lines to read and which lines to draw. I watched a volunteer attorney show a woman how to name her sister as beneficiary, how to keep a bank from deciding who she loved. The woman hugged her binder to her chest like someone had returned an organ she'd been living without. Later that afternoon, a woman waited by the door until we were almost done. She was older than my mother by a decade, her posture still holding itself like a young dancer who remembers every correction. She took my hand in both of hers, gently. He designed our kitchen when our house burned down, she said. He worked all night to get us drawings so we could feed our boys inside again. I thought you'd want to know a good thing. I thanked her. After she left, my mother wiped a place on the table that was already clean, as if smoothing the grain of something rougher than wood. I did want to know that, she said. We received an invitation to a city council meeting about renaming a small public courtyard my father had designed. The plaque was old and crooked, the metal dull with neglect. People wanted to know if we wanted it removed. What would you like it to say? The councilwoman asked. My mother looked at the plaque a long time, then at the young mothers pushing strollers past the benches, then at a teenager skateboarding around a planter he would certainly chip with his tricks. Make the new plaque about the people who sit here, she said. Not the man who drew it. When the replacement arrived months later, it said simply, for anyone who ever needed a place to rest. It made more sense. The last public thing that needed doing was the memorial at the firm, a small event for the senior partners and clients who told stories about deadlines and drinks and the time my father insisted on climbing a scaffold to see the angle of the sunset from a cornice he had drawn in pencil. When it was my turn, I chose very few words. He made beautiful structures, I said, and then I stopped, because it was both true and not the whole truth, and that was as close as I could get without breaking something that didn't belong to me. My mother squeezed my hand under the table. We went home afterward and planted rosemary and mint in the yard, herbs my mother said you grow when you want a place to smell like it remembers you kindly. She wore her straw hat and I dug the holes and we argued about spacing in the amiable way people do when their hearts are tender and their hands are busy. When we were done, she poured water from a chipped pitcher and it darkened the soil into a color that made everything else look temporary. If there was a consequence for Evelyn beyond the legal kind, it was this: she became a person again. Not a shadow or a headline or a cautionary tale whispered over chili at the church supper. A woman who made choices she had to live with and who, in the end, kept living. Once, as the year was folding into winter, we met at the bakery where the owner always burns the bottoms of the almond croissants just enough to make the tops taste like sugar and smoke. She gestured to the chair before I had to decide whether to sit. You know the worst thing I ever told myself, she asked, not waiting for my answer. That I was the only one who could give him the love he needed. She smiled without mirth. Turns out love is not a treatment plan. I didn't offer absolution. I didn't owe it and she didn't ask for it. We ate our imperfect pastries in a companionable quiet that felt like a ceasefire no one had signed, only honored. I wrote a letter to the managing partner at the firm asking them to donate the original models my father had built to the local college's architecture program. The students came with gloves and lifted the foam and basswood like they were cradling small cities. A professor asked if we'd say a few words to the class. My mother declined. I stood in front of the room and said, if you ever build for people, leave them more than walls. Leave them a way to be together they didn't have before. The students nodded the way respectful students do, and one of them asked if there were drawings of the courtyard with the new plaque. I told him he should go sit there and make his own. The night the scholarship was formally renamed, I drove by the firm alone. The lobby lights were off. The portrait was still there. I could see it through the glass, my father's careful smile catching the reflection of passing headlights. I stood on the sidewalk with my hands in my coat pockets and felt, not anger or pride or sorrow, but an odd gratitude for the ordinary ugliness of fluorescent bulbs and rubber floor mats. It is easier to forgive a person than a myth. Myths refuse to meet your eyes. At home, I found my mother at the kitchen table with the ledger open, her pen resting in the spine. She looked up, and I saw the weariness that doesn't go away when the story is over because stories don't end, they thin out into daily life. Come sit, she said, and I did. We didn't talk about the portrait or the letters or the scholarship or any of the hundreds of small verdicts that had been delivered without judges in rooms we would never enter. We talked about the herbs and the neighbor's new dog and whether the magnolia would bloom early this year. The clock ticked, stubborn and comforting. When I finally went to bed, I stood in the hall and looked into my father's old study. The desk was gone, we had given it to the foundation office where paperwork needed wood to rest on. The shelves were empty except for one book my mother had left behind by accident, a field guide to trees. I opened it at random and found a page about grafting, how you can cut a branch and attach it to another trunk, and if you bind it right and keep it watered, the sap will eventually flow from one into the other, and the tree will carry both in its rings. I touched the diagram with one finger and felt the small, ancient comfort of being told by a picture that something broken can be bound without being hidden. There was still one more public thing we couldn't avoid. The local paper wanted a final comment now that the dust has settled. I wrote 2 sentences and sent them without letting the editor call me to charm me into saying more. "We are grateful for what we were able to redirect," it read. "We hope the good done with it will be louder than the harm that made it possible." It was printed near the classifieds, surrounded by advertisements for used lawnmowers and a piano no one had room for anymore. The placement felt perfect. On a Sunday in late winter, the church pianist missed a page turn and the hymn tumbled for a measure before catching itself. People smiled at one another like conspirators in an old kindness. After the service, an elderly man I knew only as the one who wore the same brown hat every week stopped us at the door. "When my wife died," he said to my mother, "I learned I had been living on borrowed courage. Thank you for lending me some again." He lifted his hat, then put it back on, dignity restored by the ritual of its brim. We walked home. The air had that particular thinness it gets when spring is thinking about showing up but hasn't decided. My mother's arm brushed mine. "Do you think we've done enough?" she asked. I thought about the scholarship and the legal clinic and the women who folded their new papers like passports and the rosemary pushing down into the dark dirt, finding purchase where it could. I thought about Evelyn crossing a bridge without looking away and a portrait no longer being asked to hold more than the surface of a face. "For today," I said. "And tomorrow we try again." Back in the kitchen, I set water to boil for tea. The kettle began its small, rising song. I leaned against the counter and watched the steam unfurl, the window fogging at the corners like breath on glass. My mother took 2 cups from the cabinet and set them down with that quiet precision that has always been her answer to chaos. She didn't say it, but I could hear the sentence forming in the rhythm of her movements. "We are still here, we will keep making something out of what was left." The kettle clicked off. I poured. The tea steeped into amber. Outside, the magnolia held its tight fists of bud against the cold, already believing in a season it couldn't yet prove. Spring came slow that year, as if it wasn't sure we were ready for it. The magnolia tree outside finally opened one blossom at a time until the whole yard smelled faintly of lemon and memory. My mother kept the windows open, letting the scent drift through the house. By then, life had softened into a rhythm again. Mornings started with tea and the local news, afternoons were spent at the foundation, where we'd outgrown our single-room office and now rented the old insurance building downtown. It had wide windows and creaky floors, the kind that echoed laughter and footsteps alike. Sometimes, I'd catch my mother standing at the window, watching the women arriving for workshops. "Every one of them," she said once, "is carrying a story she thought would end her." "And?" I asked. She smiled. It didn't. There was pride in her voice, but also humility, the kind that comes when you've learned how fragile victory can be. One of our volunteers, a young woman named Marissa, had recently lost her husband in a motorcycle accident. She had 2 children and a quiet sadness about her that reminded me of my mother after the funeral. Over time, I noticed she'd begun laughing again at small things, like spilled coffee or a crooked sign. One afternoon, I caught her lingering after a support session. "It's strange," she said softly. "I came here because I thought I needed help. But every time I leave, I feel like I'm giving it." It struck me then that healing isn't something you find. It's something you build, moment by moment, until it becomes a place others can enter too. That night, my mother and I had dinner together at the kitchen table. It was our quiet ritual, no phones, no distractions, just the steady rhythm of silverware and soft conversation. She'd made her favorite lentil stew, the kind my father used to love. "Do you ever miss him?" I asked suddenly, surprising even myself. She didn't look up right away. "Every day," she said finally. "But not the man he became. I miss the one who planted this tree with me when you were born." The light from the window fell across her face, soft, forgiving. "It's strange," she continued. "Love doesn't vanish when someone breaks your heart. It just changes shape. You start loving them through what you've learned instead of what you've lost. I thought about Evelyn then, about the letter she sent, her quiet apologies, and the way she'd walked away that last time without asking for anything. Maybe she had loved him too. Maybe she'd paid for it differently. My mother must have sensed where my mind had gone. Don't let her become another ghost in your story, she said gently. Forgive her, and let her go. Summer came with its own kind of renewal. The foundation grew faster than we expected. Local businesses began sponsoring events. The same newspaper that once reported our family's scandal now printed a feature titled From Betrayal to Building Hope. My mother didn't want to read it. Let the past stay quiet, she said. But I clipped it anyway and placed it in our records, not out of vanity, but as proof that even broken stories can find a softer ending. That August, the town invited us to a ceremony honoring community transformation. My mother was chosen to speak. She stood on the small stage in her cream dress, holding no notes, no script. When my husband passed, she began, I thought grief would be my final language. But grief can be translated into something else, kindness, purpose, strength. What matters most isn't what's taken from you. It's what you decide to do with what's left. There was silence at first, then applause, quiet but deeply felt. I watched her step down, smiling through tears I didn't even realize I'd been holding. That night, she said something I'll never forget. You know, Nora, forgiveness doesn't mean we forget. It just means we stop rehearsing the hurt. A year later, on the anniversary of the court ruling, I visited the vineyard, the one my father had left to Evelyn, the one we'd sold to fund the foundation. The new owners had transformed it into a community garden and learning center. Children were running between rows of grapevines, laughter echoing off the hills. It didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt alive. I walked the old gravel path, my shoes crunching softly. At the far edge stood a small wooden bench overlooking the field. Someone had carved into the back. Every ending grows something new. I sat there for a long time, the sun dipping low behind the trees. In the distance, a figure appeared, older, slower, but familiar. Evelyn. She was carrying a small bouquet of lavender. I didn't expect to see you here, I said quietly when she reached me. I didn't expect to come, she replied. But I wanted to say goodbye, properly this time. She placed the lavender on the bench, her hands trembling slightly. I sold everything, she said. Moved in with my sister. I'm working at a library now, helping people find what they've lost in stories. There was a soft smile on her lips, faint but real. You found your peace, I said. She nodded. And you found your purpose. Maybe that's the only way this could have ended. Before leaving, she turned back once. He loved you both, you know. He just didn't know how to show it without hurting someone. I watched her go until the horizon swallowed her figure. When I got home, my mother was sitting on the porch with a book in her lap. The magnolia tree shimmered faintly under the porch light. Was it strange? She asked without looking up. No, I said. Just human. She smiled, closing her book. That's the hardest kind of forgiveness, the kind that understands. We sat there in silence, the night heavy with summer air and the faint hum of crickets. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour. I looked at her, the woman who had been betrayed, humiliated, and yet somehow found grace enough to rebuild not just her life but others. I hope I'm as strong as you someday, I said quietly. She reached for my hand, her palm warm and steady. You already are, she said. You just haven't had to prove it yet. In the months that followed, life became simple again, not in the way it was before, but in the way that comes after you've walked through fire and realized you can live with the heat. The foundation continued to grow. The town forgot its gossip. The garden flourished. And every year, on the same day, my mother and I planted something new beneath the magnolia tree, one flower for every chapter that ended, every truth that hurt, and every piece we earned the hard way. Here are moments, even now, when I still catch myself listening for his voice. Not because I miss him the way I used to, but because echoes don't disappear, they just change rooms. Sometimes I hear him in the creak of the floorboards he installed, or in the ticking of the clock he insisted on fixing himself. Sometimes, I even hear him in my own words, the measured tone, the stubbornness, the need to make sense of things that never will. Grief has a strange way of softening over time. It becomes less of a wound and more of a scar, something that still aches when the weather changes, but no longer bleeds. For years, I thought justice would heal that ache. That reclaiming what we'd lost, the house, the estate, our dignity, would somehow fill the hollow space he left behind. But it didn't. Justice only balanced the scales. It didn't rebuild the life sitting on top of them. It was forgiveness that did that. Quiet, unglamorous forgiveness, the kind that doesn't ask for applause or understanding. The kind my mother taught me by example. She used to say forgiveness isn't something you give to the person who wronged you. It's something you give to yourself, so you can finally sleep through the night without replaying the same scene again and again. When I was younger, I didn't believe her. I thought forgiveness was weakness. A kind of surrender. But now I see it for what it really is, the last, hardest form of strength. Because forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just means you stop letting it rewrite the present. It means looking at the people who hurt you and saying, you don't get to own what I've built from the ruins. That's what we did, my mother and I. We built something. Something good, and real, and stronger than the secret that tried to undo us. The last time I visited the vineyard, years after Evelyn had moved away, I found a small plaque near the garden gate. It hadn't been there before. For all the women who chose to stay kind even when they had every reason not to. No one signed it, but I knew who had placed it there. And I smiled. Because that's what peace feels like, not triumphant, not loud, not even joyful. Just quiet understanding between people who survived the same storm, in different ways. My mother passed 5 years after the foundation opened its doors. Not suddenly, not painfully, just softly, as if she'd decided her work here was complete. The night before, she asked me to read to her an old poem she loved about gardens and second chances. I read it slowly, the way she liked. When I finished, she said, "Promise me one thing. Anything. When the next woman walks through those doors, scared and small, you remind her that broken things aren't the end. They're the beginning of something you just don't see yet." I nodded, but she was already closing her eyes. That was my mother, calm even at the edge of goodbye. We buried her beneath the magnolia tree, beside the flowers we'd planted every year. It bloomed early that spring, too early, everyone said, but I like to think it was her way of keeping a promise. Every season since, I've gone out there with a mug of tea and sat under the branches, watching the petals fall like soft confetti. And every time, I think the same thing, that love doesn't end when people leave us. It just finds new ways to stay. Sometimes it stays as a foundation that helps others heal. Sometimes as a garden that refuses to stop blooming. And sometimes, it stays simply as a voice inside us that says, "You made it. Keep going." If I've learned anything, it's this: people are complicated. Even the ones we love most can break us in ways they never intended to. And sometimes, the apology you'll spend a lifetime waiting for will never come, not in words, not in gestures, not even in death. But peace doesn't depend on that. Peace comes when you decide you're done waiting. When you stop asking why and start asking what now. When you plant something new in the place where everything once fell apart. Every story I've ever heard, every woman who sat across from me at the foundation with shaking hands and tear-stained faces, they all begin the same way: "I didn't think I could survive this." And every single one of them does. We survive the betrayals. The letters. The will that left our names off the page. The laughter we weren't supposed to hear through the wall. We survive it all, not because we're unbreakable, but because we break and rebuild differently each time. Because we learn that strength isn't the absence of pain. It's the choice to keep living gently in a world that wasn't gentle to you. When I tell this story now, I don't tell it to expose my father. Or to shame Evelyn. or even to glorify the struggle we went through. I tell it because I know someone, somewhere, is sitting in the dark tonight, staring at a signed paper, or a text message, or an empty chair at the dinner table, wondering if they'll ever feel whole again. And I want to tell her, yes, you will. Not right away. Not perfectly. But one day, you'll wake up and realize the pain that once filled every corner of your life has become a quiet guest, still there, but polite enough to keep its distance. You'll start noticing small things again. The sound of rain against the roof. The smell of coffee in the morning. The way sunlight warms the table where you sit alone, but not lonely. And when you least expect it, you'll smile. Not because everything's fixed, but because you've made peace with the parts that never will be. That's the real inheritance my father left me, not the property he almost took away, not the money he hid, but the lesson that everything can be rebuilt if you refuse to let bitterness become your architect. My mother and I rebuilt something that will outlast us both, not a house, but a place of safety for others. And maybe, in the end, that's all we ever needed to inherit. So if you're listening to this right now, if you've been cut out, left behind, or told your story is over, remember this. You still have time to write another chapter. You still have a voice. You still have a choice. And you still have the right to start again, not because you forgot what happened, but because you've learned enough from it to finally move forward. Would you have done what I did? Would you have fought to reclaim what was taken, or simply walked away? Tell me in the comments. And if this story found you at the right time, stay a while. There are more stories waiting to remind you, you're not alone. Because sometimes, the hardest truths lead to the gentlest new beginnings.